Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever looked around the world and wondered why some places are just thriving, buzzing with innovation?
While others seem, well, stuck,
Trapped.
trapped in poverty almost.
Exactly. What is fundamentally driving that huge difference?
Yeah, they're massive questions, aren't they? And people have been asking them for ages. But this stack of sources, especially the ones centered around why nations fail, they offer a really compelling way to think about it.
It's fascinating stuff. So our mission today is basically to dive into these sources, pull out the key ideas about, the real roots of power, prosperity, poverty.
And how history is still playing out right now.
Right. It forces you to look beyond the usual explanations, doesn't it?
Definitely.
So as we explore, let's keep that core question in mind. What really separates the winners from the losers, economically speaking? Let's get into it.
Okay, so the main thread, the sort of central argument running through all this material, it's that the primary driver isn't, say, geography or culture or even just like bad decisions by leader on their own. It's the institutions within a society.
Right. Institutions. That sounds a bit academic. What do we mean precisely?
Think of them like the rules of the game,
Okay.
the laws, how property rights work, economic regulations, political systems, and, crucially, how those rules are actually enforced. They shape everything the incentives people have, how money flows.
Who gets to decide things?
Exactly, who holds the power to set the rules. So it's less about the specific person in charge.
And more about the system they're working within.
Precisely. And the sources make this really sharp distinction between two main kinds of institutions, two paths almost.
Okay, let's hear about the first one.
Right, so first you've got extractive institutions. And the name kind of says it all.
Designed to extract things.
Yeah. Wealth, resources, income. From one part of society, usually the majority, for the benefit of another part, typically a small ruling elite.
So the whole system is basically rigged.
You could say that, yeah. The characteristics are things like insecure property rights for most people, maybe forced labor systems, monopolies that block competition, anything that stops new businesses or new ideas from threatening the people at the top.
Keeps them safe in their position.
Right. The main goal is maintaining the elite's control and their ability to keep extracting. It's a system built to keep most people down, essentially.
Okay, that sounds pretty grim. What's the alternative then?
That's inclusive institutions, totally different foundation.
How so?
Well, here you've got secure private property rights for a broad section of society. You've got the rule of law, meaning the law applies more or less equally to everyone, even the elites.
Right.
Markets are generally open. New people can start businesses, and the state actually plays a role in supporting these markets, maybe investing in education, infrastructure, that sort of thing.
And the key difference sounds like who has the power?
Absolutely crucial. Inclusive institutions have to be pluralistic, meaning political power isn't concentrated in just a few hands, it's spread out more widely. And there are real checks and balances on anyone who holds power, even the top leaders.
So no one group can just rewrite the rules for themselves.
It's much harder, yeah. When power is shared, different groups have to negotiate, compromise. It prevents that kind of naked extraction.
So under inclusive systems, people are more likely to, invest,
Yeah,
innovate, take risks.
exactly, because they trust that if they succeed, they'll actually benefit. They won't just have it taken away. The system enables them, rather than just extracting from them. It creates this positive feedback loop.
A virtuous circle, maybe.
That's the term they use, yeah, a virtuous circle.
Okay, that distinction makes a lot of sense. Extractive versus inclusive. But how do places end up on such different tracks? The sources use the early Americas as a big example, right?
Oh, it's a perfect, almost natural experiment. You look at the Spanish approach in places like Mexico and Peru and compare it to the English starting out in North America, like in Jamestown.
Right. The Spanish found these huge established empires, Aztecs, Incas. How did that affect things?
It was absolutely pivotal. Cortez in Mexico, Pizarro in Peru, they realized pretty quickly they could capture the leader, like Moctezuma or Atahualpa.
Decapitate the system.
Kind of, yeah, take control right at the top. And once they did that, they could grab the gold and silver that was already there, but more importantly, they could take over the existing systems of tribute, taxation, and forced labor. These empires were already really effective at extracting resources from their populations.
So the Spanish didn't have to invent an extractive system.
Not at all. They just sort of slotted themselves into the top spot of the existing one. Their goal was quick riches, gold, silver, land. and forcing other people to do all the work through things like the encomienda or the mita system.
Right. Now, contrast that with the English landing in Jamestown. They had similar ideas initially, didn't they? Gold fever, using native labor.
Oh, absolutely. That was the dream. But the reality on the ground in North America was totally different.
How so?
The indigenous groups there weren't organized into these giant centralized empires ripe for takeover. There wasn't the same kind of existing infrastructure for mass forced labor.
And the Jamestown colony was famously struggling, right?
Yeah,
Starving.
terribly. Yeah, near collapse multiple times. Their attempts to bully the local Powhatan Confederacy into feeding them, or find gold, just didn't work. Captain John Smith is often credited with realizing, look, the Spanish model just isn't going to fly here.
So they had to adapt, trade, figure out how to survive themselves.
They had to. Survival forced them onto a different path. It wasn't necessarily that they wanted more inclusive institutions from the start, but the conditions on the ground, the inability to just replicate Spanish-style extraction, pushed them in that direction. Little differences in the beginning.
Leading to huge divergences later on.
Exactly. It laid the groundwork for fundamentally different institutional paths.
What really stands out is how sticky these paths seem to be. Once extractive institutions get set up, they seem incredibly hard to get rid of. That's the vicious circle idea.
That's it, precisely. Extractive institutions generate these powerful negative feedback loops. Think about it. The small elite, benefiting massively, has absolutely zero interest in changing the rules.
Why would they? They're doing great.
Right. They have every incentive to keep things exactly as they are and to crush any potential changes that might threaten their grip on power or wealth.
Even if those changes might make the whole country richer overall.
Especially then, sometimes. This brings up a really key concept the sources discuss, the fear of creative destruction.
Creative destruction, like new technologies, new industries shaking things up.
Exactly. Elites are often terrified of this because new ways of doing things, new economic forces, they redistribute wealth, they create new powerful groups, they shift political power.
In ways the old elite can't control.
Precisely. So to protect their position, they actively block progress, they sabotage innovation, they'd rather keep the whole pie smaller as long as they get to keep their disproportionately large slice and stay in charge.
Wow. Are there clear examples of this?
Oh, tons. The sources give some really striking historical ones, like the Roman Emperor Vespasian.
What did he do?
Apparently, someone came to him with an invention, a machine that could transport heavy columns up to the Capitoline Hill using much less manpower. A clear technological advance, right?
It seems like a no-brainer.
But Vespasian refused to use it. His reason, he supposedly said, how will it be possible for me to feed the populace?
He was worried about unemployment causing unrest.
Exactly. Political instability. He feared that putting lots of laborers out of work would make the population unruly and threaten his control. So, preserving political order, his order, trumped economic efficiency. It wasn't ignorance, it was a political calculation.
That's incredible. Blocking progress out of fear.
And you see it again and again. Ottoman sultans resisted reforms that threatened entrenched interests. In 19th century Russia, Tsar Nicholas I and his ministers actively opposed building railways and factories.
Why on earth block railways?
Because they feared it would spread dangerous ideas. They saw industrialization creating a working class, fostering dissent, maybe leading to revolution like the Decembrist revolt they'd already faced. Nicholas reportedly swore a revolution wouldn't happen on his watch. They wanted to keep the power with the landed aristocracy, keep the serfs tied down, even if it meant Russia fell further and further behind Europe economically.
So keep the system static to keep control.
That was the logic. Same thing in Austria-Hungary, elites blocking industry and transport for similar reasons. Fear of social and political change.
It's this recurring theme then. Elite self-interest, maintaining political control, overriding everything else.
It really is. And this vicious circle isn't always about one strong dictator, is it? Sometimes the problem is the opposite, too little central power.
Absolutely. Somalia is used as an example of this. Power is so fragmented among different clans, each strong enough to resist centralization, that no one can establish basic law and order, let alone implement reforms.
So any attempt to build a functioning state is seen as a threat by other groups. Exactly. It leads to the state of perpetual instability and conflict. You can't have extractive or inclusive institutions if you can't even establish a basic monopoly on violence and order. Conflict gets resolved through traditional means like clan negotiations or blood money because there's no effective state.
So it's not just active extraction, but also the absence of effective institutions that can trap a place.
Right. The fragmentation itself becomes the trap.
Thinking about more recent times, where do the sources point to this vicious circle still playing out?
Well, Guatemala is a stark example. The legacy of colonial extraction, forcing the indigenous Maya population into low-wage labor, just continued after independence, morphing over time. You had military strongmen like Yubico in the 20th century who actively fought against any industrialization or worker organization. He apparently even banned words like workers or unions.
Really? Banned words.
That's what the sources suggest, because he saw any organized labor as a political threat. The methods changed from colonial repartimiento to debt peonage or land grabs, but the basic structure of elite control over land and cheap labor persisted for centuries.
That continuity is pretty sobering. What about Africa after independence? Hopes were so high.
Tragically, the sources argue, many new leaders just stepped into the colonists' shoes. They inherited these extractive state structures and used them for their own benefit and their supporters.
So instead of dismantling the system,
Yeah, just took it over. Patronage networks, manipulating markets, using state marketing boards to squeeze farmers. The same tools, just different beneficiaries.
wow.
The sources quote marks about history repeating first tragedy, then farce, but argue that in places like Mobutu's Zaire, the farce was often even more tragic than the original colonial tragedy. Leaders like Siaka Stevens in Sierra Leone, Kabila taking over from Mobutu in Congo, Mengistu in Ethiopia, they often mimicked the extractive methods of those they replaced.
And Zimbabwe, under Mugabe, fits the pattern.
A very clear, more recent case study, according to the sources, systematically dismantling checks and balances, eliminating opponents, rewriting the Constitution, seizing control of economic institutions.
All to consolidate power and wealth for his inner circle.
Yes, and crucially, to prevent an independent business class from emerging that could challenge his political dominance. It wasn't about national development, it was about controlling the levers of extraction.
And that example of forced labor in Uzbekistan's cotton fields, that sounds like something straight out of the past.
It's presented as a direct legacy. The Soviets used forced mobilization for cotton harvests, and the post-Soviet elite, particularly around the president, just continued the practice, forcing students, teachers, public employees into the fields for pitiful wages.
While the state profits hugely.
Exactly. It's a modern continuation of an old extractive institution adapted for the benefit of today's elite.
Okay, so we've dug into the vicious circle, why poverty is so persistent. Let's flip it. What about the virtuous circle? How do inclusive institutions create prosperity and maybe protect themselves?
Right. It's the positive feedback loop. Once you have inclusive institutions, secure rights, open markets, broad political power, they tend to reinforce each other.
How does that work?
Well, the benefits of economic growth are shared more widely, so more people have a stake in the system. And because political power is distributed, it's much harder for one group to just come in and wreck it for everyone else. Broad coalitions form to defend the inclusive setup.
It sounds like England's history is the classic example here.
It's the main one traced in the sources.
Yeah.
And it wasn't some smooth, planned journey. It was messy, full of conflict.
Going way back. Magna Carta and all that.
Yeah, Magna Carta in 1215 wasn't about democracy. It was barons protecting themselves from the king. But it was an early step in limiting absolute power. Then you had centuries of struggle between the crown and parliament.
Parliament using its power over taxes to demand things.
Exactly. Like pushing back against Queen Elizabeth's thirst, granting monopolies to her favorites. Monopolies are extractive, right? Parliament, representing wider interests like merchants, fought against them.
And these struggles were shaped by big historical events, critical junctures.
Yes, these moments that shake everything up. The sources highlight a few for England, like the fall of Rome had a bigger impact in Britain, weakening central control more thoroughly than on the continent.
Okay.
Then the Black Death. Horrific, but it decimated the population, making labor scarce and empowering peasants and townspeople against the old feudal lords.
Shifted the balance of power.
Big time. And then the discovery of the Americas. We saw how it reinforced extraction in Spain.
But in England.
It empowered new groups, especially merchants involved in Atlantic trade. These groups were already pushing for more power via parliament, so the same event had different effects depending on the existing institutions.
Leading up to the Glorious Revolution in 1688. That was key.
Absolutely pivotal, because it wasn't just one faction replacing another. It was a broad coalition gentry, merchants, different political factions uniting against the king's attempts at absolutism,
And the outcome?
a decisive shift towards pluralistic politics, and crucially, the strengthening of the rule of law.
Meaning the law applies to everyone, even the rulers.
Yes, and this wasn't just idealism. The different groups in the winning coalition realized the best way to protect themselves from any future grab for absolute power was to establish strong rules that constrained everyone. It was mutual self-interest leading to better institutions.
And the economic impact of that.
Huge. Secure property rights, predictable laws, support for markets. It unleashed innovation. Think the Industrial Revolution. Inventors like Watt or Arkwright could expect to profit from their ideas because their rights were protected.
And the system kept evolving. More people demanding rights.
Exactly. Pressure from below, like the Chartists demanding the vote for working men, continued. The system, because it was pluralistic, could adapt and incorporate these demands over time through reforms, making it even more inclusive. It reinforced itself.
And the U.S. is seen as building on this foundation.
Yes, the U.S. Constitution, with its checks and balances, aimed to create inclusive institutions from the start, drawing on that English experience. But even inclusive systems get challenged.
Like by powerful economic interests. The robber barons.
Right, people like Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, Carnegie. They built enormous economic power through trusts and monopolies, and definitely just tried to bend the political system to their will. Vanderbilt's famous quote, "What do I care about the law? Ain't I got the power?" kind of sums it up.
So economic power threatened the political pluralism.
It did, but the system pushed back. Because it was relatively inclusive, you had reform movements, populists, progressives arise, you had antitrust laws passed and eventually enforced, braining up monopolies like Standard Oil.
Even presidents faced pushback.
Yeah, the sources mention FDR's plan to pack the Supreme Court when it was blocking New Deal legislation. It was controversial and ultimately failed, partly because even people within his own party worried about undermining the independence of the judiciary. They understood, perhaps implicitly, that weakening those checks and balances could backfire on everyone later. It's that virtuous circle logic, again protecting the system, protects everyone within it in the long run.
Okay, so these cycles, vicious and virtuous, are powerful forces. But can countries break out of the bad one? Is change possible for those stuck in extraction?
Definitely. The sources stress that it's hard, but yes, change happens. Often at those critical junctures, moments of crisis or massive disruption. And it really depends on specific events, who wins key power struggles. There's no magic formula.
Japan's Meiji Restoration is one example given.
A classic one. Mid-19th century, Japan's facing gunboat diplomacy from the West. A group of elites, especially from outer domains like Satsuma and Choshu, realize, oh, we need to modernize or we'll be colonized.
But the existing rulers, the Tokugawa shogunate, were tied to the old feudal system.
Exactly. So this reformist elite had to actually overthrow the shogun to implement the radical changes needed, abolishing feudalism, building a modern state and military. It was an internal power struggle, triggered by external pressure, that led to dramatic institutional transformation.
What about the American South? That seems like a deeply rooted extractive system that was changed.
A really important case, and it highlights how change often requires conflict and sometimes unusual coalitions. The end of the Jim Crow system wasn't voluntary. It came through immense struggle by the civil rights movement.
Black Southerners demanding basic rights.
Yes, combined with the intervention of the federal government, representing the broader, more inclusive institutions of the U.S. as a whole.
Did economics play a part too?
It seems so. The mass migration of black labor out of the South, plus the mechanization of cotton farming, gradually made the old system of cheap, repressed labor less economically essential for the elites. It didn't make them want to change, but it likely weakened their resolve and shifted the power balance during the conflict.
And modern China, post-Mao. That's a huge shift.
It really is. The sheer devastation caused by Mao's extreme extractive policies, the Great Leap Forward famine, the chaos of the Cultural Revolution created a massive internal demand for something different.
An opening for change.
Exactly. It allowed Deng Xiaoping and his allies to win the power struggle after Mao's death and pivot towards market-based economic institutions, introducing incentives, allowing private farming, opening up to trade.
But the political system stayed extractive.
Largely, yes. That's the crucial point the sources make. The Communist Party maintained its monopoly on political power, so China shows that significant economic growth is possible, at least for a time, under politically extractive institutions. often through state-directed investment or mobilizing resources.
But it's a different kind of growth.
Yes, perhaps less reliant on broad-based innovation and creative destruction. And the sources definitely raise questions about its long-term sustainability and adaptability without more political pluralism.
So change is possible, often through struggle, especially when things are shaken up.
That seems to be the pattern. And understanding these institutional dynamics helps explain why so many efforts to fix poverty just don't work. The sources take aim at some common explanations that they argue are wrong.
Like blaming geography. Oh, it's too hot, or they don't have resources.
Yeah, they push back hard on that. The Nogales example, one city is split by the U.S.-Mexico border, same geography, climate, diseases. Vastly different prosperity levels. It's the institutions, not the location.
Right.
Or think about the Incas building a complex society high in the Andes versus North America's situation before colonization. Geography didn't predetermine that. History and institutions did.
Okay, now geography. What about culture? Some cultures just aren't cut out for capitalism.
Also rejected as the primary cause. Again, Nogales. Same culture, different outcomes. They argue culture is more often a result of institutions, not the cause of them.
Wow, so.
Like the Kingdom of Congo adopting European guns because the slave trade, an extractive institution,
Right.
made them valuable, but ignoring the plow because their institutions didn't incentivize agricultural investment. Or apartheid South Africa deliberately creating policies to keep black workers unskilled that wasn't culture. It was an imposed economic institution.
So institutions shape incentives, which shapes behavior, which can look like culture.
Exactly. And the last big misconception they tackle is leader ignorance. The idea that leaders in poor countries just don't know the right policies.
Like they just need better advisors from the World Bank.
Haha, yeah, something like that. The sources argue no, leaders usually know exactly what would generate growth for the country. They just choose not to do it because those policies would threaten their power or the wealth of their cronies.
So it's calculated self-interest again.
Pretty much. The example used is Kofi Busia in Ghana, whose policies wrecked the economy but were considered good politics because they appeased powerful urban groups and kept him in power temporarily. It's about political survival within an extractive system.
And that ties into why foreign aid often fails too.
Right. It's not just about corruption, although that's part of it. Estimates suggest maybe only 10–20% even gets used as intended sometimes. But the bigger problem is that aid can actually strengthen extractive regimes. By giving rulers resources they don't need to earn through productive economic activity or taxation, they can use aid money to buy off the military, reward supporters, and stay in power without having to build inclusive institutions. It can remove the pressure for reform. Think of Mobutu getting billions while Zaire crumbled.
So aid can inadvertently prop up the very systems causing the poverty.
That's the danger highlighted.
So if there's no simple recipe for building inclusive institutions, are there any ingredients that help?
The sources suggest a few things help make success more likely. You need some degree of centralized order, basic law, and security. Complete chaos like Somalia makes progress impossible.
Okay.
Having some pre-existing traditions of pluralism, even limited ones, or constraints on executive power can provide a foundation to build on.
Something to work with.
Yeah. And the presence of an active civil society groups that can organize people, voice demands, push for change seems important too. It helps prevent opposition from being easily crushed or just descending into more chaos.
Makes sense. This whole deep dive really hammers home that history isn't just one thing after another. It's this constant struggle over the rules, over institutions.
It really is.
Yeah.
That conflict between extractive forces and inclusive pressures is everywhere. Throughout history, Roman Republic, medieval England, modern nations, the outcome always depends on the balance of power, on whether broad coalitions can successfully challenge elites and build or defend inclusive systems.
So wrapping this up, our look at these sources suggests it's really the institutions, the rules, who makes them, how they evolve through conflict in history that are the deepest drivers of prosperity and poverty.
Yeah, it argues pretty strongly against geography or culture or just leader mistakes. It comes down to political power. How it's distributed shapes the economic institutions, which then shape incentives and outcomes. And these systems tend to persist, either viciously or virtuously.
Though change, driven by conflict in critical moments, is always possible. Which leaves us with a pretty big question looking around today, doesn't it? Where are the really critical institutional conflicts happening right now? What seemingly small shifts or power struggles today might be the things that, looking back, turn out to have been a major turning point for a country or even the world.
Yeah, definitely something to think about.